So, are Western values worth defending? What are Western values anyway? To some, Western values is code word for Eurocentrism or even white supremacy. Others, however, view Western values as embodying the rule of law, individual freedoms, freedom of conscience, free speech. To help answer this question, we invited two guests. Our first guest, Faisal Saeed Al Mutar, is an Iraqi-born writer, satirist, human rights activist, and computer geek. Faisal was intellectually forged in Iraq during the post-9/11 US invasion. He's an advocate for secularism, human rights, and the free market of ideas. A big enthusiast of the intersection of technology and advocacy, Faisal is the founder of the global secular humanist movement and the president of Ideas Beyond Borders. Our second guest is a full-time faculty member in the Department of Philosophy at PSU. Dr. Peter Boghossian is an international speaker for the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Science and Reason and the Center for Inquiry. He has an extensive publication record across multiple domains of thought. Dr. Boghossian is the author of A Manual for Creating Atheists, creator of the Atheos app, and one of the two academics behind the Conceptual Penis Feminist article hoax. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Boghossian.
Wow, this is a packed house. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thank you for joining us tonight. Good to see some old faces and some new faces and some friends.
That's ages of you. But,
that is ageist of me.
Yeah.
I'll add that to the
we should accept
list of
people
grievances.
regardless of their age.
So tonight we're going to talk about, are Western values worth defending? And let me throw out the agenda for the evening. Excuse me. I'm going to ask Faisal about himself for maybe a couple of minutes. We're going to talk about that, what brings him here to this chair. We're going to define Western values. What do we mean so that we're all on the same page? What do we mean by Western values? Once we've done that, we can have a conversation. And I want to ask if those values are under threat or thriving or neither, or should we promote them, or what, if anything, should we do about them? So before we launch into our discussion, welcome. Welcome.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for being here. I mean, first of all, I would like to thank the amazing Andy for organizing this.
Really amazing.
And actually, also the officers in the group of the Freethinkers that I need to mention that as well. I mean, this is actually my first time in Portland. So I'm very glad that I'm kind of famous here. That's maybe that's something I should consider, but I'm still happy living in the East Coast. That's my safe space. I mean, a small intro. I mean, maybe I'm going to make it as big. So I was born and raised in Iraq, born in Babylon, small town, maybe mentioned in the Bible multiple times. But I grew up mostly in the capital city of Baghdad. I spent my childhood living under the Saddam regime, and then the infamous Iraq War happened in 2003, and as probably some of you follow the news, in which the country kind of went into chaos. Fast forward, sectarian warfare and lost members of the family there. My story of activism, for the lack of a better word, started with the first Iraqi elections in 2005, and I saw like the rise of the sectarian tone of Sunni versus Shia, and that led to sectarian elections, and I was advocating as the kind of what Rodney King, when he says, why don't we all people get along? So I was the Rodney King of Baghdad at the time, advocating for secular governments, because I thought that is the best way in which people from different sects can coexist. That didn't end up well. I got so many death threats, and I had to leave the country in 2009. And I moved to Lebanon, Southeast Asia, and I got admitted to the United States as a refugee. I've been working in the Middle East, and as well as now with my new organization, Ideas Beyond Borders, focusing mostly on the Middle East specifically, and Arab world abroad, which I think we'll get into soon. This is this is me. And,
Welcome. This country is very fortunate to have you.
Thank you so
And
much.
I mean that.
And just to add, I mean, what kind of brings me to this stage, what I think is, not that I want to be self-grandiose, I'm not Donald Trump, I'm not going to talk about myself that long, but is that, I mean, as I mentioned in the intro, is like I lived most of my life under authoritarianism. I mean, now I do not, terms and conditions apply. But, I mean, my childhood and my teenage years, I've lived in places in which the values that we're going to talk about tonight were non-existent. And it surprised me sometimes how many people who grew up in Western societies kind of take it for granted to the way that they don't think they are worth defending. So I think this is going to be an interesting conversation. I'm very glad to be here.
I want to interrogate that thought as well, but...
Well, don't interrogate me. I think I've had enough when it comes to that word. Yeah.
There's one more thing, if I may ask you, before we launch into the definitions. There's one more thing that you do that I find fascinating. And if you wouldn't mind, just 30 seconds, what is this book translation project you're doing?
So this is actually like a reincarnation. So in Baghdad in the 13th century, there was a project called Bayt al-Hikmah, which translates into the House of Wisdom, in which the Caliph, not me, I'm a secular Caliph, but that's the other Caliph, used to translate books of science and humanities and human rights into Arabic. So now we're starting a project called Bayt al-Hikmah 2.0, in which we translate science and human rights material and enlightenment values into Arabic and spread them through our distribution channels across the region to empower the Arab youth to make them more adhere to many of these values. And I would say I'm very optimistic that there is a lot of movement out there that is going towards that direction.
I just love that. I just so respect that. All right, so let's dive in. So just so that you and I are on the same page, in order to continue any conversation, we need to define some terms.
I'm all in favor of that.
I'm a big fan. What do you mean, or what do you take, or how do you interpret Western? The sentence is, "Are Western values worth defending?"
Yeah, so I mean, this has been an ongoing conversation that I have in the media and stuff. Is that I'm not comfortable with the term Western values because it shows that these values are regional focused and these people from outside the West have never contributed to that, the Enlightenment, or cannot participate in it. And it kind of makes a prerequisite, maybe I disagree on that you kind of have to be Western or adhere to a Western identity for you to adhere to these values that we're going to discuss. So, for example, I can still support individual rights, but I'm not giving up my falafels, right? I'm not giving that anytime soon. And we just had one, actually, just an hour ago. But I think
Can you interrupt you? Give me an example of somebody you think out of the West who stands up for Western values.
I mean, I can tell you about someone right now, a very close friend and a hero, in my opinion. His name is Raif Badawi, who is the president of Conscious Amnesty International, got in jail in Saudi Arabia. He writes about the values and importance of equality under the law, human rights. He got arrested, freedom of religion, which back to definitions, that's what I define as Enlightenment values. And he's arrested for it, and he's in jail for it. And there are many people in Bangladesh slaughtered just last year for adhering to these values. So there are people from all over the world, and I would argue that many are existing in the Muslim world, who adhere to these values, and they need not to give up their language or their identity. So I'm more, I wouldn't say happy, but I think that the values, identifying these values as Enlightenment values, will help a lot in spreading them as well as defending them globally. Because I do think that these Enlightenment values should be universal. I think human rights should be universal.
Okay, so are you, because I am comfortable, that's where I was going to go with it. Are you comfortable if we, and people, of course, in the audience in the Q&A, they can take aim at us or take issue, take aim. No.
And the snipers here?
No, take aim. That's a horrible turn of phrase.
I hate it when that happens.
Are you comfortable then substituting for Western values, Enlightenment values, and then continuing our conversation on that basis?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, because I also think that the term Western values is really ambiguous and confusing to me.
I agree.
I mean, do people, let's say, in Arkansas who think that gays are not equal to human beings? I mean, actually, that's not just like, I don't want to single out Arkansas, but just something that got out of my head. Do people does Ted Cruz adhere to Western values?
Right.
Does Donald Trump, the current president, adhere to Western values?
Right.
My answer would be, I mean, Does he adhere to Enlightenment values? No.
Yeah.
But does he adhere to Western values? Maybe. Because I think the term is very ambiguous. That, as I said, like it's very ambiguous. It's also geographically focused. I think that I would be much more comfortable defending and standing for Enlightenment values than defending just whatever that.
Okay, I agree. I think that's a fuzzy term that links it or pins it to a geography that I personally am not comfortable with. So,
and both of us, I need to mention, I mean, you are from Armenian origin,
that's
right?
True.
And
That's
I'm from
true.
Iraq.
That's true.
So both of us adhere to Enlightenment values,
That's
and
true.
that just shows. And so both of us are not from Western background, and
That's excellent. Yeah.
oh, I like to remind you of your origin, but yeah, this is both of us adhere to these values, and we are not originally from here.
Okay, so then let's define what you mean by and what I mean, because we may not agree. What do you mean by Enlightenment values?
Well, I mean, I think if there's one word that solidifies what enlightenment means is the concept of the importance of the individual over the collective. And that, I think, what originates the concept like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom from religion, as we're talking to freethinkers, and freedom, and I mean, what can be codified pretty much in the Bill of Rights of the United States. So these are what makes it different than, let's say, the non-enlightenment values is because the individual matter. So your rights come from freedom of speech, regardless if you existed in a Christian majority country, Muslim majority country. You as an individual matter, and I think that's what kind of made the shifting point within Western Europe, and in terms of focus on the individual versus focusing on the rights of the collective. But so that's what I think enlightenment. I mean, there are so many discussions about what the Enlightenment really is and what are the 10 commandments of the Enlightenment, if there is any. Yeah. But I think the word that solidifies it is the value of the individual over the collective.
And within that sphere, there's, and I'm just throwing this out, of course, you can free to retreat. There's freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, which is big and coming back in Iraq now, I've heard, but I'm no expert in that. So it's coupled with notions of liberal democracy, but the individual is at the center with some basic freedoms. Is that?
Yes, and that's the closest I can get to my definition as well.
Yeah, you know, Kant has something. It's a phrase from a poet, "Dare to Know," that I think covers the idea of the Enlightenment pretty well. And it's the courage to think for yourself, the courage to use the tools of science. And I think, to me, that's always been a helpful heuristic to think of what it means to think in that tradition of the Enlightenment. All right, so I'm happy that we're on the same page. I'm satisfied. Are you cool to proceed?
I'm satisfied as hell.
Okay, all right. So do you think Enlightenment, where do we stand with Enlightenment values? You think that they're under threat? You think they're thriving? You think neither? You think both? Where do you think we stand?
I think it really depends on region to region. I think that, my full-time job is focusing on analysis on the Arab world, and mostly when it comes to progressive values and Enlightenment values. Not want to mix up, because progressive can mean different things in different countries, so I don't want to get into that. But, and I can say with complete confidence that many of these values are rising up in many parts of the Arab world. And there are so many metrics.
Can you give me an example of that?
So I'm going to give you multiple ones. Okay. But number one, in terms of a country, for example, the country of Tunisia, which is a modern country, not modern country, but a modern democracy after the Arab Spring. They recently issued multiple laws that says women inheritance is equal to man, because they believe in equality under the law. People have the right to convert to another religion or from religion.
So I'm going to pause you. So equality under the law, that's egalitarian. Basically, people are treated under the law. That's an Enlightenment value.
It is, yes. And the rights for women to have the same inheritance as a man.
Right.
Because under theocracies, that's not available.
Which is codified in the Quran, which I probably shouldn't have said. We'll edit that out of the video.
Yeah, please edit that.
But so go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a separation of mosque and state, or separation of church and state. That is an Enlightenment value. Right. They're allowing recently, I think about a week ago on the BBC, there was a news about the fact that a woman can marry someone outside their religion without or a man actually can marry someone outside the religion without in any way that the other person need to convert to that religion. So they are allowing for people to have multi-religious, which is actually to their credit. This is the only nation in the Arab world and also in the Middle East, even in Israel, it's not allowed to actually marry someone from the other religion unless you convert. Right. So to their credit, Tunisia is actually, I would say now is become more progressive than many other countries.
Progressive toward Enlightenment values.
Progressive towards Enlightenment values.
Yeah.
And as for projects, I mean, as I mentioned that's kind of the metrics that we use. So there's a project called I Believe in Science that is about raising scientific inquiries, and they're translated the theory of evolution books, and also I think the UC Berkeley page of the Q&A about theory of evolution. It has like 1.5 million followers on Facebook. There's a figure who's satirizing religious institutions, and also there's hundreds of thousands of people following him. Also, I mean, the guy, the John Stewart of the Middle East, Bassem Youssef, also has tons of millions of followers. Multiple times he made fun of religious establishment, and he has also millions of followers.
What country is he in?
He's from Egypt.
Wow.
And so, yeah, so there are so many metrics. I mean, obviously, I'm not in any way going to deny that it's all rosy and everything is beautiful. But, I mean, many of these people are still under threat. Many of them get killed for doing what they're doing. But at the same time, it's worth mentioning that, because I think what's happening, not that this is the Western media fault, I'm not being like Donald Trump here, but it's like, unfortunately, because when there's suicide bomb, right, and this kills 100 people, 1,000 people, that becomes the headline, right, what you see it on CNN. But generally, they don't cover that there are some positive aspects happening in terms of turning that these countries into more countries that are aligned with.
Yeah, I have to thank you for that, because the year after Trump, for a year of Trump, I need some positive news. Like I need.
We all do actually.
I need something positive. So that was.
Even though alcohol is a solution, alcohol is a solution, but it's not a solution for everything. I have to mention that. Yeah.
Okay, so I think those are good examples of when Enlightenment values, we've seen people outside the West hold on certain Enlightenment values. You think that there are times when the Enlightenment is under threat?
Definitely. I mean, and so back to the region, I think in the West, there's a trio that a friend of mine, Majid Nawaz, have created in what you call the trio of danger, which is the far right, the regressive left, and the Islamists. Yeah. And all of them kind of complement each other in a way. They all need each other to survive. The SJWs need the Richard Spencers, and Richard Spencers need the SJWs. So, and the Islamists need the Pickets, and so on. So I think that this trio is bringing so much danger to Enlightenment values in the West. And there is a term that's coined by also a friend of yours, Steven Pinker. He coined the term the left pole. Right. So the left pole is that, so when you're on the left pole, everything is slightly on the right of you is far right, right? So like, I was called like a fascist by a left pole person. And there's also the right pole people, those who are on the far right, that everything slightly to the left of them is a regressive leftist and a communist. I mean, so in a way, like I think last week I was called a jihadist and a Nazi, and I was like, oh, that's impressive. I mean, my mom thinks I'm smart and I can play different characters on internet, but it seems like it's a pretty. And also the Islamists who, even if you are a slightly, let's say, liberal Muslim or moderate Muslim, whatever these terms now mean, is that you are non-real Muslim, or you are an apostate, and you're committing a blasphemy. So I think these folks are moving the West into a very polarized society. And I mean, we're seeing like the rise within France. You have Marine Le Pen, and you have the left on the other side. You have in Germany the AfD, one part of which is the kind of the far right party, and there's in UK you have the Labour Party on the other hand, and you have the UKIP, which is the one by Nigel Farage. And there's a great article by Thomas Friedman about a year ago saying like America is getting West Europeanized, in which that politics are getting more and more polarized to the way that the other side thinks that the other side is evil.
Right.
It's not like we have a slightly disagreements. No, you are a fucking Nazi. Right. No, you are a communist. Like, so this is that polarization is very damaging to a healthy democracy. It's very damaging to the values of the Enlightenment, in my opinion, because they're the ones who are attacking them from censoring speakers and punching Nazis and whatever. Because the thing is like, I mean, I hate Nazis as the next person, right? But the thing is like, according to these people on the left pole, everyone disagrees with them as a Nazi, right? If you say like you support Obamacare, not universal health care, you're a Nazi. I'm like, oh, that's impressive. So then they advocate for punching these people, right? And then on the far right, okay, you are, let's say if you support some form of socialism or social safety net, you are like a communist. And then communists are evil. We should punch these communists. Or, so like this polarization is very damaging.
Yeah, so it's the polarization and I hate the word victim because it's been so co-opted, but is the mic okay? Yeah. So that's a problem. I'm deaf in one ear, so I'm never really sure if things are actually auditory illusions or not.
Turn it upright.
Turn it upright. How's that? Thank you.
Wow.
See
Thank
that?
you.
See that? What happens when you turn something around? Okay, so the damage that's being done by the polarization and by the far left and the far right are two Enlightenment values, and I want to call those values out. It's being done to freedom of speech. It's being done mostly, but not exclusively, on the far left to freedom of speech. It's being done on the far right by our president to freedom of the press. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was saying,
if
it's
you
like,
disagree, that's great.
Yeah, in terms of freedom of speech, I think now with the president, there's attacks on the press, kind of make
right.
I would say the president is worse because he has more power than a bunch of students on college campus. But that's a separate conversation.
So Enlightenment values are under attack by the far left. Enlightenment values are under attack by the far right. And I think one of the consequences of that is we've seen the center split apart. We've also seen the emergence of a new center. But one of the consequences of polarization is I think it's taken a tremendous toll on our liberal democracy. It's taken a tremendous toll on our conversations. It's taken a tremendous toll on our friendships. And there's like a purity test.
I've heard that a lot in the Middle East. We also have purity tests, right? But have a different meaning. It's more physical, but yeah.
Right. So there's a purity test on the left, and the right has its own kind of purity test that you have to be in complete ideological congruence with these, whatever the beliefs of the day happen to be.
Yeah, I mean, I call them the 10 Commandments of the left, 10 Commandments of the right. It's
right.
Like you adhere to all these 10 Commandments, and if you don't, you're a sellout. You're an Uncle Tom. You're a Zionist. You are, and that ends the conversation right there. But if I think that the other person is evil, how would I have a conversation with them? So it's an assumption of guilt, immediate assumption of guilt, and then that ends the conversation, and it all becomes virtue signaling.
Yeah, and I often wonder the way to navigate that when when people don't value what are constitutive elements that bring our society together, these basic freedoms. So I want to, at the risk of offending everybody, I
think we haven't done that already.
Okay, we haven't done that already. And isn't this crowd great? Nobody's freaking out. No one's throwing tomatoes. No one's punching anybody.
Give yourself a round of applause.
Yeah, right. Excellent. Excellent. Seriously. Very well. Portland State, it's good. We can.
Well, I come from Iraq. My bar is already low for everything. So no one is a suicide bomber here. That's awesome. I love it.
Okay, so you just came back from a debate. I think you debated Oscar Nomani on
I did, yeah.
Trump, and you're not a Trump fan, to say the least, and I'm not a Trump fan, to say the least. Nevertheless, I thought it was appropriate, given the day today, that I read something from President Trump's recent speech in Poland, and I wouldn't even be flabbergasted. It was absolutely impossible that these lines could come out of the president's brain. It's just simply not possible. But still, it really comports very well with our Western values worth defending. And I'm going to read from his recent speech in Poland, and I'd like you to comment on that, please. Quote, "The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert and destroy it? I mean, unfortunately, it came from Trump, but I think that there's something, it probably came from Bannon, but...
Or Wikipedia, maybe.
Or Wikipedia, yeah.
Or
but
Goodreads quotes.
I think that there's something incredibly profound in that. And I think that those questions are really questions that we need to wrestle with in a democracy, and that we need to wrestle with when we talk about policy issues like building walls, when we talk about, pro-America first, even in such things when we talk about how to deal with the opioid epidemic. But what is your take on that? The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive and the confidence to defend our values and protect our borders and to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert and destroy it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's assume it was written by Trump or someone.
Okay.
I do think, so the problem, to some extent, is the messenger of
Sure,
saying this message. So
absolutely.
that's important to acknowledge. Is that, yes, as I said, that these values are under threat, and these countries who have a codified system of, I'm going to use enlightenment values, not Western values, but those who have a codified systems of enlightenment values, many of them happen to be in the West, they consider that these values are under threat, and I might say something that will make me sound like a hypocrite. I'm complete opposed to the travel ban by Donald Trump. I've made many interviews about it, and
You were just on CNN about it.
yeah, I was on CNN about it, etc. So I'm not a fan of the ban, but when I always do these interviews, I think I mentioned I'm against the ban, and then they just take this quote and say, "Oh, Faisal Saeed Al Mutar is an Iraqi refugee who's against the ban," and that is not the full quote. The full quote is that I do think, considering that I'm from a country that has terrorism, I've escaped terrorism, I've lost members to terrorism, right? I'm not in denial whatsoever that there are people who are coming from the Middle East or coming from parts of the Muslim world who hold values that are threatening to Western values, and or who want to impose some of these values into the West.
Right.
It is.
I was stopping you. So I think this is a very important distinction, and I think the conversation gets lost in, oh, these people are coming to kill us.
Yes, that's why.
And that's Douglas Murray's point as well, and I think it's well taken.
Well, Douglas has a different view than I do, but it's.
But so you're talking about introducing large numbers of people, or X number of people who have values that are antithetical to the Enlightenment.
Actually, for me, the issue is not even numbers. I think that I thought that America was a small country before I moved here, but it seems like it's quite big, that it can take a large amount of people. But the issue is the values these people have, right? So I wouldn't mind if there is 1 million Raif Badawis come to America,
Right.
in my opinion. I don't mind whatsoever if there are people who adhere to values of liberal democracy, value how much it has taken for these countries to adopt these values. I do, however, I don't think it is racist or Islamophobic or that the United States or Canada or New Zealand or all these countries will say, you know what, we're a country, it's enshrined in the Statue of Liberty, right? Get the poor and so this is a central value of America, that America is a welcoming country to immigrants and etc. That being said, if someone is coming here that wants to do FGM to his daughter, wants to use that as a law to make FGM legal in America, want to adhere to values of theocracy or turn America to another version of theocracy, maybe in a smaller place, as was happening in Europe, in which you have neighborhoods that are filled with religious extremists. Belgium, for example, became a larger exporter of ISIS. That's a fucking problem. When Belgium is becoming one of the largest exporters of ISIS, maybe it's time for the West to kind of reconsider what they have done wrong, in which that many places in Europe. I mean, I was in Denmark about a month ago, and maybe 2 months ago, and there is like a police car in front of every synagogue. Well, that's insane. Like these, and who they are afraid of. I mean, let's be honest. They might have some fear from the neo-Nazis who might, because the Jews unfortunately are hated by multiple people. So it's not only the Islamic extremists who hate them, but also the neo-Nazis who do as well. But this is dangerous. I think that when the West, when the countries that have and that's actually, I would add Tunisia into that. I would add any country that adheres to enlightenment values that have them codified to achieve that is to make sure that we will stand for these values and we will constantly defend them and not change the laws and not apply different laws to different countries or different laws to different places within the country.
Like the travel ban.
Yeah, not when the travel ban is a foreign policy. I'm talking more of a domestic policy approach. Is that for example, issues, for example, they're having in the UK, in which there are places in which FGM and domestic violence happen, but the women are afraid to report to the police, and sometimes the police, out of cultural sensitivity, don't do anything, right? This is a fucking problem. This means that this is what I mean actually by that we should stand and defend, because in a way, the West is, when they not defend these values, they are siding not with the minorities, right? Because there are minorities within the minorities, right? The women who live from Muslim societies, who live in the UK, and the gays, when they get persecuted, and you don't apply the law to quote-unquote Muslim communities, whatever that means, you are harming the minorities within the minorities. That's what I mean by the West should defend its values, or enlightenment values.
I want to linger on that point because that was a turning point in the way that I thought, or that helped me tremendously think through these issues. And was it Ayaan Hirsi Ali who came up with the idea of minorities and minorities, or Majid Nawaz?
Majid Nawaz. But I think you're probably alluding to racism of our expectations, which came from David Frum.
No, I'm not. Specifically thinking about problems not in terms of minorities, like the Muslim minority, but thinking about conceptualizing a problem in terms of how are minorities within minorities treated? How are homosexuals within these communities treated? How are Jews within these communities treated? And I think that is a shift in thinking. It's just like a lens that you can use to help figure out, or at least it's helped me tremendously figure out or think through immigration, or think through some of these issues. And I was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit, that minority within a minority.
Yeah, actually, I would go further. I mean, it's the individual that matters. Exactly. I mean, regardless if they're a minority or a majority or supermajority or superminority, is that that individual, regardless of their sexuality or regardless of their gender identity or whether they're women or they deserve their universal human rights.
Exactly.
And
which is an enlightenment value.
Which is enlightenment values. That's what I mean. So it doesn't matter even if minorities within minorities are not persecuted, it doesn't matter. I mean, that's, I think, what is really important about the Enlightenment is that it brought the focus that the individual matters, regardless of their, wherever they come from, or is that they matter. So, but what I was talking about with the minorities within minorities is that what happens within, unfortunately, some segments of the left and also within the right is that these generalizations that that the Muslim community have like some sort of one issue, or the way that they engage of generalizations, and it's not only done to Muslims, also other minorities, African Americans and Hispanics and stuff. That is, I think, is very dangerous because you're dealing with these groups. You deal with the people within this group, not as individuals, but you're dealing with them that, like for example, it's kind of funny anecdotal thing, is that I was hosted in a house in San Diego, like by this cultural diversity hosting, and so they thought because I'm a Muslim, coming from Iraq, they immediately thought I'm Muslim, and they had most of the alcohol there, so like they were afraid that I will get offended. I'm like, I drink a lot actually, but the thing is like, so they were hiding like all of their bottles of wine and everything. Actually, it was funny. So I was like, oh, I'm going to the store. Do you want me to buy you some beer? That's why actually they figured out that I drink. So then they're like, oh, we're sorry. Like, oh, we know you drink. So they brought all the alcohol back to the table. And that goes back to the generalization, right? So they mentally put a generalization. Okay, there's this guy who's coming from Iraq, which is the majority Muslim country, undeniably, but they didn't see me as an individual. They saw me as a part of a collective that they have put in their head has a certain characteristics that these people don't drink, maybe don't listen to music, maybe. But that is entirely false. I mean, I lived in Muslim countries, I mean, most of my childhood, my teenagers, and even some part of adult life. And yes, Muslims belong to a much large, diverse group than people from the outside see them. There are Muslims who drink, there are people who go to wear a bikini. And
just on that.
So not all of them are like burqas and socially conservative. I mean, that's actually insulting, I think, in my opinion. It's insulting to the Muslim community when you don't see them as diverse individual groups, individual people, but you see them as one group with one certain identity that I'm going to tell you what you should behave like. And if you don't, and that's what happens sometimes within the left, if you don't subscribe to this like perceived notion of that identity, you are not a true...
That's exactly
no, and I've got that a lot. And which like, oh, you speak English, you don't sound like a real Arab. I'm like, what? Like, can't Arabs be bilingual? Like, is that offensive these days? So it's because they have a perceived notion of what you really are. If you don't do that, you're an Uncle Tom, trader, of these.
I think I see two problems. I guess one of my pet peeves is this whole push that we have towards cultural sensitivity. Cultural sensitivity is basically essentializing a group and assuming that they all participate in these characteristics, which is itself antithetical to what it's trying to do in the first place. But my second problem with what's interesting to me, it's always interesting how people become fundamentalists in terms of somebody else's religion. Oh, he drinks, he can't be a real Muslim, from a guy who's not even a Muslim.
Yeah, that's called also offended on behalf. Sometimes it's like you see people back, I think it belongs to the same group, in which they get offended. I mean, I don't want to give so many anecdotal evidences, but somebody was making a racist joke, which I sometimes appreciate. I don't mind racist jokes once in a while. And then there was a guy offended on behalf of me, telling my friend to fuck off. I'm like, this guy is my friend, and I know that he's joking. Like, stop intervening in the conversation. So he was offended on my behalf, and telling him, no, I know better. I am Mr. White Knight who will save you from.
I put a tweet out about that. Like, I think it says like.
Please stop tweeting.
I know. I'm trying.
Stop, Peter. Stop it.
We need a word for people who are offended on behalf of others, and there's this bizarre cultural phenomenon that we see manifesting all the time with that. Okay, but I'm gonna pause on that. And I want to go back. I'm going to bring it back to enlightenment values.
Yes, that's the conversation, I guess.
Yeah. Before I do, there's something unbelievably both provocative and thoughtful about those quotations, and ironic. The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert and destroy it? I think he's one of the people who's trying to subvert and destroy it.
Yeah. So that's why I said the messenger bearers in this. And back again to the conversation about Western values versus Enlightenment values. I mean, maybe for him, Western values are more of this nationalistic nonsense of building walls and stopping tacos from coming here. But so that's maybe his definition of Western values. I mean, sometimes it's that. I mean, as I said, like, does the person who is anti-gay probably thinks women are less? Who's coming from the West? Let's say his name is James Smith. I'm just making a name up. But does he adhere to Western values? I think, in my opinion, he does not adhere to Enlightenment values for sure.
Absolutely, and that's why that distinction is critical.
Yeah, I think that's the distinction is critical. So I think, like, when it comes to Trump, I think by Western values, he's seeing it from more, or the West, he's seeing it from more of a nationalistic lens of anti-immigration rhetoric. That we have to defend us from them, these other guys outside, and I think, but so that's why, for example, back to his policies when travel ban. I mean, one of my biggest opposition of for example, travel ban, not from just pure identity politics that I'm a refugee and I support refugees, but I am against. I mean, Mark Twain famously said, "All generalizations are false, including this one." Okay. So one of the things that Trump has with the travel bans is that it's a generalization on entire populations. you cannot generalize on all. I mean, even if there are six countries, maybe small, some of them have larger population than others, you cannot generalize on all country and condemn an entire nation.
Right.
So I think that's what he means by. So again, he's not looking at his individuals. So when you condemn an entire nation of 20 million, 25 million, etc., you are not looking at these people as individuals, looking at them as a collective, which is, in my opinion, against the values of the Enlightenment, which focus mostly. I mean, if he was talking about values, okay, we're only going to accept people who adhere to the values of the Enlightenment, who are not threatening to Western liberal democracy, etc., I might actually go in agreement with him. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with Trump just because he's Trump. I think some people are becoming hysterical these days, in which even if Trump says the Earth orbit the sun, they will go like, I guess Trump. Like, but I think it's like because he's seeing many things through pure nationalistic angles, that he's and also coming from Western Europe, like with all the far right and like, for example, there was this discussion on The Guardian about there was I think it was Richard Spencer, and he told an African British guy that you can never be an Englishman. You are not an Englishman. You are not one of us. So I think that this is where these far-right, alt-right people see things from, is that if you are not born in this part of the world, or you come from the different side, you are not part of the West.
Right, and those are not Enlightenment values. So here's something I've been thinking about. I wonder if we could use somehow Enlightenment values as a resource against extremism. And one of the things I've been thinking about is how do we promote Enlightenment values? But very specifically, how do you promote Enlightenment values with people who don't buy into the values in the first place? I mean, it doesn't have to be Enlightenment values. You can substitute, you can stick in any kind of values there. How do we promote, and Sam Harris tried to do that in Moral Landscape. Yeah. I mean, how do we promote values to groups, or even should we? I personally think we should. How do we do that if people don't buy into those values in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, I think there is a prerequisite belief when it comes in that, is that you need to believe that people are capable of change, right? Yeah. Is that people can change and can change their behavior or their beliefs if there is a convincing argument to their that they can believe in. So I mean, I actually do believe in that. So I do believe that people are capable of change. I mean, as I said, my close friend.
We know they're capable of change. People change. That's why there's the word apostasy, leaving religion. I mean,
exactly,
we know they're capable of change all the time.
To give you an example, Majid Nawaz, the guy we're talking about, he was a former Islamist. He was a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is kind of like a Muslim Brotherhood group, and now he's a liberal Democrat. I mean, he kind of moved from to...
Now he has the Quilliam Foundation.
Now he has the Quilliam Foundation. He wrote a book, Radical, and he wrote another book with Sam Harris, etc., etc. So, I mean, a guy who probably used to view someone like Sam Harris as someone worthy of killing, to writing a book with him. So, so people are capable of changing. And I think when it comes to that, I mean, it's all about what type of arguments that you need to use to convince them that these values are important. I mean, give you an example in Iraq. Which is now being used by a lot of Iraqi politicians. Formerly, it used to be Alawi was the former prime minister, but now many other people are using it. So, I mean, what is the biggest issues in Iraq right now? We have civil war, right? The sectarian warfare. To some extent, there's now in Syria, etc., etc. So, one of the arguments they're using is that what is the best way to end that conflict? Yeah. The best way to end that conflict is actually to have, not to have a Sunni state or a Shia state, is to have a state based on secular government to get away from the sectarian warfare. So to some extent, it's reaching to the personal, right? So you kind of reaching, I think I always believe in this concept that you have to reach the people's personal interest in order to engage them. So you tell them, okay, so you want your son or your father not to be blown up tomorrow by a Sunni extremist or a Shia extremist. How about we have a civil government that gives we're going to have an army that is neutral. We're going to have a police.
Value.
Exactly.
That's an Enlightenment value.
So, but see, like the way that they have reached out how to convince these people to adhere to these values. It was not like, oh, if you read Sam Harris, you're going to be able to get to us. They reached their personal interest that value is actually going to save your life. Right. So that is, for example, one way which I think is an effective way of getting these values across is to go to the personal interests. And I mean, for example, like there is, I think it's Dick Cheney, I think his daughter or his son are gay.
His daughter's gay.
His daughter is gay, right? So because his daughter is gay, I'm very sure that many people will try to convince him that, see, like, now your daughter is gay, so do you believe in gay rights? And I think he is supporter of gay rights coming from the Republican Party, right? So I think always when we're trying to change minds, you have to always to appeal to the personal interest of person, and also, go back to what can really affect them. Because if you're gonna talk about things, I mean, you're a philosopher. I'm not. I'm just a homeless guy. But like, I think we need to stop talking just in theoretical stuff. I think if we always tell people what's really, really affecting them, like go to their basics of life and try to use, because I think enlightenment values are universal and can be applied everywhere. So we can tell them, okay, so you are a Sunni, by the way, this is a Shia majority state. If you don't believe in the freedom of religion, you will get killed. Or if you don't believe in freedom of expression, you as a communist might not be able to protest or have a student protest. Always like go to what they actually adhere to and try to get them to their side. I think that's probably one of the most effective ways. And probably there are others that I would, if you have some, maybe we have an audience that would listen.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, so what time?
8 more minutes.
8 more minutes.
Let's all have a prayer.
The room will empty out very quickly. So we talked about how to spread enlightenment values. We talked about, is there anything else you'd want to talk about? Because in a minute, I do want to make sure that folks have questions, and if you disagree with anything we've said, we're going to bump you to the front of the line. So we're looking for people who disagree with some of the ideas we've voiced here.
So we're going to give a priority flight ticket to anyone who
yes,
has
priority.
opposition to
You
us.
have priority if you disagree.
First class on
right
Delta
to the front.
Airlines. Just kidding. I don't understand.
So is there anything else that you want to say before we take questions? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think major comment is that I think that, so I think we agree with the notion, I mean, to get back to the question.
Yeah.
We agree to the notion that enlightenment values are definitely worth defending.
Unquestionably.
And I mean, I don't want to use identity politics or personal experience here, but many of you guys may take it for granted that you live in a place in which there's a freedom of religion. You can convert tomorrow to whatever religion. You can be a Scientologist tomorrow, and you're going to get beheaded for it. But there are people in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, in many parts of the Muslim world who are literally dying and getting killed every day for what you take right now for granted. So I just want to make sure that this comment gets across. And also, I mean, I think to end it on a good note is that there are people. I think there are many of us. Seems like we had a full room here,
house, packed.
And I can say based on the research I'm doing constantly around the Muslim world and the Arab world that I'm mostly focused on, that many people, more and more people, are adhering to it today than before, and I really hope that we will win. So thank you very much for being here.
So you do have priority. If you disagreed with anything that we said, we'd love for you to come on up and
So
talk
for the
to
Q&A,
Andy.
hello? I'm actually going to ask that you stay seated, and I'll go to the aisle we're at, and I'll hand you the microphone. There's a lot of people here, so just try to be respectful. Please don't go in a tirade. But everyone's been very respectful so far, so we trust you with the microphone.
Going to tirade against him.
No, please no.
So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, make yourself seen, and the speakers will select you.
Sure. Well, lady here.
Hi.
So you mentioned that when you were talking about the Civil War that the best way to really solve that conflict is through a secular government. I've noticed as a relatively recent voter, because I'm pretty young, that I always hear in our political debates some candidate mention religious affiliation. And I've always found it incredibly interesting because we're supposed to have separation of church and state. So do you think that the United States truly has a secular government? And if we do or do not, do you think there's a country that best represents that value of having a very clear separation of church and state?
Yes, I think it's codified in the Constitution that there is to some extent, a separation of church and state. Maybe some people disagree with me on that, but that's the kind of, I think, the paradox of secularism is that secularism and liberalism allows non-secular and non-liberal opinions to be expressed, right? While non-liberal and non-secular governments do not allow secular and liberal values to be expressed. So there is a paradox within liberal secular values that they kind of allow non-secular people who adhere. So yes, I mean, leave aside people just saying the religious affiliation. I mean, there is maybe not as big as what it is in the Muslim world, but there is a threat to American secularism from the religious rights who want to bring some theocratic values. And many of the, back to climate change, abortion, same-sex marriage, etc., etc. I mean, what is that? The guy who brought the ball, like an ice ball to the Senate or something? I never senator which state he was, and he brought like an ice ball. He said, "See, climate change is not real. Noah is gonna make the earth great again." And and he wanted to pass laws, mostly coming from a religious perspective. I've come to the country that. In a weird way, I even though that's also kind of a paradox. So Scandinavia is actually not secular per constitution. So it's actually they still have an official church. So the Church of Denmark, the Church of Sweden, and Finland, etc. Yet they seem to have a lot of secular laws. Even the UK is not secular, at least government-wise. But you see that many of the laws that they introduce in Parliament are using reason and science to which I find really impressive compared. I think there are some theories about that of like the countries that has a kind of like a built-in church into them, like the UK and Denmark, etc. Which I think from Daniel Dennett is that because in order for you to oppose the government, kind of secularism becomes a part because now you are a dissident against the government mixed with religion. Therefore, like most of the opposition becomes secular, while in countries that are secular constitutionally, the opposition comes from religious people. So in a weird way, that also creates another paradox. Sorry if I tired your brain, but there is. I do think that Scandinavia seems to have.
And then let's take another one.
Have kind of the closest I would like to have in a secular state, or at least secular in terms of laws.
Disagreements. We're looking for people who disagree.
Well, we have a Kurdish guy who disagrees with us.
Hi. Yes, I'm a Kurd, and
so I don't want to single you out. I support your independence, so don't.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
In the Middle East, there is the potential for a secular governments to look at that. There is a parallel secular culture, and many Arab countries, such as Lebanon, and non-Arab in Turkey, I think, the separation of church and state or mosque and state in Turkey was very, very strong up until very recently. But
forget about that. Yeah.
There is one question I want to ask. When do you think free speech becomes abused free speech?
You want to take that?
Actually, we can we answer both of us can answer the question? I would like to talk about the Turkey part because I kind of forgot that when you were talking about the threat of enlightenment values, and I was talking about the negative things, Turkey, unfortunately, is one of the countries that is declining, in my opinion, in terms of adherence to enlightenment values. With the recent government, actually not recent anymore, with Erdogan government and the social, Justice and Development Party that is now ruling, they are arresting academics for saying opposition opinions, arresting journalists. They are declining in terms of their secularism. And there are reasons to that, I think, because in terms of, that's why I like the Tunisian model more than the Turkish model, because unfortunately the Turkish model of secularism came through force. With all my, I might like Ataturk in some issues, but I think he definitely was a strong Turkish nationalist and secular who persecuted the Kurds, persecuted many other people. And so the model that he built for Turkish secularism, in my opinion, is far from ideal, and I much prefer the secular democratic model that Tunisia followed. As for free speech, I think you have a guy who was much more of an expert than an Iraqi refugee.
So the question specifically was what I was listening to his answer. Is there?
Abused.
So that's a difficult question. In this country we have we can look at jurisprudence. We have a whole system of laws. It's really it's a legal question, but I can give you some general rules of thumb. Here's a rule of thumb, and no matter how many times I've explained this, there just must be something that is so complicated in this idea that I don't know, maybe I'm just not good at explaining it, but if somebody has an immutable characteristic, that is something that they cannot change, their height, their skin color, their eyes, then any criticism of that is off limits. Ideas are mutable. Ideas are changeable. People change their beliefs, but people do not change their skin color. I was going to make a joke about his love of falafels, but I don't know how appropriate it is. But
Does it change the skin color though?
Well, I don't know. Not really. No, not really. But so that's one way to look at it. And there are gray areas there, but the law has made it very, very clear, and people have articulated that. I can give you the philosophical justifications, but people have articulated that very clearly in the body of law that we have.
I mean, I just want to add to that for a bit. I mean, because that's a question. Now with the recent elections, I think it's being discussed a lot about the Russian intervention and whether social media companies should kind of infringe on the right of free speech.
Is that what you meant by the question?
Yeah,
okay.
But
I didn't take that at all.
Yeah, I think it's very morally confusing in my opinion because when I was in Wisconsin, there are people literally believing that Hillary Clinton did the human trafficking in a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. There are people who literally believe that. And that's not a joke. Even though, how much, there's a guy who came into the pizzeria holding a shotgun. I don't know, what is the solution to that, right? I mean, it is kind of unfortunate that people believe that. It's kind of like Alex Jones, right? Like gays can people, I don't know, something frogs, gays can turn people to frogs. Is that it's very unfortunate that there are people who believe this today. And it is a result to some extent of free speech, right? It is a result of people like Alex Jones and others using free speech laws to kind of spread complete garbage, right? And yet people believe that to some extent that they might vote differently. And I think that's something that Russia have played really well. Maybe I don't want to make it, I'm 100% sure Russia has done it, but it seems like, I don't know where the line is, at least when it comes to how many companies, big companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter, etc., how much they can have the right to censor material.
If that was what you meant by the question, but you said no. Yeah, I'd give a totally different response to that. And now, when Dave Rubin has had guests, we've talked about this. He's talked about this, that threats from freedom of speech don't necessarily come from governments. It comes from these new technologies, Twitter and Facebook. And Trump's Twitter feed went down, and they're talking about giving the guy a Nobel Peace Prize. But the ideas behind that is that there have been power shifts due to this technological infrastructure we've developed. All right, let's see if we can keep cranking these out.
I agree that individualism is a way to foster enlightened values, but I also think that as a world, we face problems that need collaboration, hunger and climate change, things like that. How do you keep individualism while working as a general population?
Is this question to me or to both?
Either one of us?
Yeah, either.
I agree with you that there are some issues that are affecting us globally. For example, climate change, right? There is a response. Not necessarily just as individuals, as a country. It's affecting us globally. So countries have to do something to work collectively, to work together to reduce climate change or try to. So I'm not like this fully, because I think that if someone takes individualism to the hardcore, and then the profit becomes the only motive, and then so there's no interest, for example, to oil companies to do anything good for the environment. They want to make more profit, so there has to be some kind of like a collective mindset in some issues, in which, because some of these issues are affecting us all. It matters what a company like BP or Shell or others are doing to the environment, because there are people elsewhere who live in the same planet, right? So I do agree with some sense of I mean, that's why I support the UN, even though that's kind of, I support the idea of the UN, let me be clear. I don't support some of the bureaucracy that exists in the UN, but I do think that we need some, especially on issues affecting the planet and affecting humanity altogether. I think we need to work together as countries, as individuals, and have kind of collective mindset of how to protect the environment and protect us, humanity as a whole. But Peter might have a, are you good with my answer?
No, that's good. Let's let it stand. I'd love to see if we could just roll through these.
Okay.
So we talked about secularism today. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on positive social change and religion. So you think of civil rights movement led by MLK, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Ruby Sales, all religious figures. And like you have Pope Francis talking about climate change seriously now. How can religion be a force for enlightenment values, as you say it?
Oh, that's
Boy, that's a hard one.
that's a wonderful one.
Boy, I'm really gonna have to think about that.
I think both of us need to think about that. That's actually a very good. That's a proof of a good question when you need to think about.
Yeah,
the answer.
it's just hard for me to take, for example, the Catholic Church, which is basically the largest rape and pedophilia organization history has ever known. It's hard for me to take them as any kind of defender of Western, of Enlightenment values, and any kind of moral authority is just so utterly repugnant given their stain on humanity that they've left. That I don't know the answer, George. I'd really have to think about that.
I mean, I can give you a much more different answer than what Peter has given. So I mean, the way I look at religion is, I mean, I look at religion as a human institution, and that the human institution is up to develops and sometimes regresses. And every religion, I mean, especially the major ones, have multiple interpretations. I call it the interpretations from extremism. I create the scale from 1 to 10, 0 being one being culturally religious, and 10 being the extremist religious or the fundamentals. In case of Islam, like ISIS is 10, and somebody who's like an ex-Muslim or a cultural Muslim would be 0. So I do think, like, when we talk about religion becoming a positive force, if the interpretation of that religion adheres closely to the values of the Enlightenment. I mean, someone interprets religion as is all about social equality for people.
Or like liberation theology in the 90s.
Yes, I mean liberation theology, or what we sometimes refer to as Islamic Reformation,
Right,
Islamic
Islamic,
modernization. I actually don't like the term Reformation because it's mixed up with the Christian Reformation, which was not really peaceful. But in terms of like if somebody follows interpretation of religion, I mean secular Judaism and Quakers in terms of Christianity, and Islam, the kind of the Mu'tazila, which is like the Quranists and others who have many values and have contributed, in my opinion, a lot to the rise of the values of the Enlightenment, at least within some parts of the world. I mean, the Islamic Golden Age, I mean, it's kind of a misnomer.
Isn't one of the problems, I don't want to get lost in the weeds of this question, but...
Well, we have to disagree on something, so let's fight.
Okay.
Yeah.
But isn't one of the problems of that, not only that there's a hermeneutic, like problem of interpretation, but the problem that they're giving these things as edicts and these values aren't rationally derived. I guess my problem with the question is that if you can't derive your values rationally, you can't really be said either to know them or they're arbitrary. Your values are arbitrary if they're not rationally derived, and that's the problem I have with that question.
But I would argue they might contribute to the conclusion, right? So let's say somebody might derive their values from an irrational behavior, right, or irrational belief. But let's say we take the values, separation of church and state, blah blah. Yeah. So for example, like
render unto Caesar.
Render unto Caesar, right?
Yeah.
That's actually a perfect example in which somebody might be secularist because of believing in that verse. Or for example, within Shia Islam, like some version of Shia Islam in Iraq, for example, Ayatollah Sistani believes that government, that the Ayatollah's job is to be kind of a spiritual leader. The government and religion should not be mixed. And according to his interpretation of religion, that the Ayatollah's job is just to be a guide for the people, not necessarily a figure as in political figure. So he might give us the conclusion that we need a secular state, which is an Enlightenment value, but his drive for that value might come from, according to Prophet Muhammad, verse this and verse that and verse this. So I think I mean to answer this question, I think that the religious people, religious values can contribute to the conclusion of enlightenment, but not necessarily how enlightenment values in both of us, I think, our opinion is that they should be based on reason and coming from reason.
Yeah, and my other problem with that is there has to be there's intrinsic to what it means to be reasonable is that there's an element of revision in that.
Yeah, I mean,
and so that these folks can drive the bus of toward the Enlightenment or what have you, but it would be that they would get there from an arbitrary way. I don't know. There's just something deeply disturbing. It was a great question. There's something deeply disturbing about that to me.
I mean, I'm not as strong against religion I used to be, but I think is that if people, I mean, most of my work, I work with religious people a lot, and now I follow the methodology that if you care about the conclusion, if both of us agree on the conclusion, that's what all matters to me. If you want human rights for all, if you want secular government, if you want freedom of speech, hell yeah, I work with you. Regardless of how did you come out to.
But what if they want it because they're afraid if they don't get it, they're going to burn in hell for eternity?
Well, I mean, that's going to be a separate conversation because you're dealing with people who, I mean, do not adhere to it. So I'm talking about working with religious people who believe in Enlightenment values, but coming to it from a religious, quote-unquote, standpoint. Right. So that's kind of a difference, I think, between, I mean, those who oppose it from a religious standpoint, of course, I think we need to speak out against them and make sure that they get defeated in every election. But as for those who have the same conclusions as us, but coming to it from a religious standpoint or spiritual, whatever that means, I think we should work with them and not kind of go into the nitty-gritty of where they get
I think
their...
I agree with that.
Yeah, great.
Great. Let's see if we can...
Great question, by the way.
Excellent question.
You deserve a falafel.
You both immediately came out as advocates of free speech, but both made multiple statements about not wanting to offend anyone and spent more than 5 minutes combined on just that topic, which was more than 8% of your time up there.
That's pretty specific.
If you're spending that much time on not offending someone, do you really feel like this is somewhere that you can speak freely?
Sorry, I didn't understand it. But Peter, maybe you can explain the question.
So I'm going to tell you my interpretation of what you said, and then you tell me if it's correct. Can you stand up so I can see you? Do you still have the mic? Yeah. So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. So we talked about offending our people, and the concern is, do you think we can speak freely? Is that the question? Like, why would we talk about offending people?
Not the one time that you kept feeling that you should go back to it after your first statement, when it was very clear that neither of you are hateful people in any way, that you're not, directly attacking anybody.
See my Twitter feed. Everyone's calling us both Nazis. No, for real. Like, literally. I just want to comment. I think it's worth talking. I had to delete my Facebook page, literally, because people are going around contacting people I know, saying horrible things about me and telling them I'm a white supremacist. My daughter's adopted from China, by the way. Saying that I'm a white supremacist, saying that I'm a Nazi, saying I'm a Nazi sympathizer, writing my name on the wall that I'm a Nazi and a Nazi. The impetus, what is animating this horrific animus? Any reasonable, rational person would ask that question. It's because at the Christina Hoff Summers Dave Rubin event, and repeatedly I've said I am adamantly opposed to punching people if they have repugnant beliefs, be they neo-Nazis or not. I don't believe in physical violence. I'm a pacifist. I find it repugnant. And so the part of the inroad to the joke that we were making about offending people is that that's the big thing right now, is that everybody's either talking about being offended or being offended on someone else's behalf. I don't really care if I offend anybody in this kind of a context. And that's because of the rule that I said to him, our friend with the hat up front. It's because if that offense comes at an idea, it doesn't mean anything to me. But if the offense comes because I've made a mistake and I've made a harsh judgment or harsh words about a characteristic that somebody can't change, well, that's a problem, and I need to, do some looking at myself and apologize and be very sincere about that. But we are in a culture right now in which it's hyperpolarized, as he said, and everybody is so terrified of offending each other. So those comments were somewhat tongue-in-cheek. They weren't meant to be serious. And I do feel that in this particular event, right now, in this moment, that I can say virtually anything that I want, and I do not feel that Portland State University will come from me in any meaningful way.
But I just want to add, that's a very good answer. I mean, what I add to that actually, I think that freedom of speech and the word offense are actually linked to each other, because the freedom of speech means nothing if you're not able to offend. In fact, it is about unpopular and sometimes offensive speech. So, like, I mean, I grew up under Saddam. We had a freedom of speech if you like Saddam. In fact, I would argue that there is no freedom of speech unless it is because if it's a popular opinion that everyone agrees upon, there is no, you don't need any protection, right? Because it's a popular view that everyone agrees upon. Freedom of speech and offense, in my opinion, I think this is a quote from Salman Rushdie, who's been one of the biggest victims of Islamic extremism in terms of Iran, I think, multiple books, and he got a death threat from the Ayatollah Khomeini about this, is that he's like, what is the concept of free speech without offending people? It literally means nothing. Freedom of speech means nothing without the right for defend unpopular opinions. And to add to what Peter said about, I thought your name was Muhammad, but when he said about like humans and immutable characteristics, I always say humans have rights, cultures, beliefs, and ideas don't have rights. Ideas and culture should be up to debate and criticism, and human rights should have. Humans should have rights universally across the board.
And remember Ronald Reagan's caution: freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction.
We quoted two Republicans in this. Does anyone have a Democratic quote that we should?
Let's see if we can get some more in there.
First, I'd like to make an observation. So there was that Catholic joke on pedophiles, and I find that interesting because we did talk about, not making generalizations. If we talk about organizations committing sins against humanity, well, we can look at Western countries and find plenty of examples. So with that said, I'm going to go to my question, which is, enlightenment is basically based on this idea of rationality, science, and progress. And we keep talking about Western as that being a Western value. My issue with that is that it implies that others do not have those values, or that there is a monopoly on those values by Western countries.
I answered that.
I thought we spent the 20 minutes pounding that idea down.
I'm getting to my question. Thank you. So others would argue that Western value is the accumulation of wealth. And it seems to me, and I guess you talked about it, and maybe I didn't hear you, but you're conflating human values and rights with Western values. So how is this whole conversation not just promoting Western exceptionalism and white savior complex?
So did you write those questions before, and I'm really sincere when I say this.
I read it as
Did you write those questions before we spoke?
No, I've been writing them as I listened to you speak.
But just to clarify, were you here when we had the first question?
I've been here the whole time we've been taking questions, but...
No, I mean like when the event started. Because that was the first question we had in the conversation, was are they Western values or Enlightenment values? And I mentioned that I don't think they are Western values, and there are people from all over the world who adhere to them. But I just want to...
And you gave the example of...
That's because the term Western values is very regional-centric, while I think that Enlightenment values are people from all over the world believe in them and participate in them.
It's just that you continue to use that throughout the conversation.
Did we? Well, if okay, well then we have a genuine difference of opinion. That way that you perceive this talk is not in any way whatsoever in accord, in even remote alignment with anything that I've said this evening. But I will and I'm serious, I will place that misunderstanding on myself, and I will watch the video again when it comes out. I usually never watch anything that I do ever. But I will watch it, and I will take that consideration in mind. But I don't think that's even remotely anything that we've said from the beginning of the talk.
Well, I hope so. I hope my accent wasn't very clear, but I mean, yeah, just hi.
Sure, go ahead. You mentioned that something I disagree with was the identity issue of comparing a Muslim identity to an English identity, and I see that as
Oh, when Richard Spencer said that to that.
Yeah, I think well, maybe I misunderstood, but the way I understood it was that, I think of an Islamic identity as a religious identity. So when I think of it this way, I think that you would have to ascribe to that ideology in order to be in the identity. And then I don't see a reason why somebody would get offended if they don't ascribe to the ideology, if somebody were to say, well, you're not a Muslim. So I grew up to be a Muslim, for example. And if somebody says, well, you don't believe in, Jesus being the Son of God, so you're not a Christian, I would never get offended because I don't necessarily ascribe to a certain ideology. So in that sense, maybe unless there's on your part, saying that there's a misinterpretation of whether or not the Islamic religion allows drinking, for example, right? If it doesn't allow drinking, and you drink, and somebody says, well, then you don't ascribe to the ideology, I don't see a reason for anybody to get offended, right? But if you do get offended, it's telling me that you would like to hold on to that identity. So if you would like to hold on to that identity, that's probably giving you some sort of benefit. I'm just curious, what is the benefit of holding on to an identity that has a list of rules
But
that
he's
you
not
don't necessarily...
he's not a Muslim.
Okay. So.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to answer like some of what you said. Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about offense, whether someone is going to feel offended or not. But I think is that, I mean, my point was that I am against this notion that there is a fixated meaning of what's to be a Muslim, because Islam is a religion and ideology that has multiple interpretations. And are you a practicing Muslim, by the way? Do you consider?
Well, that's the thing. It's a very ambiguous thing to say. So because
no, the reason I'm asking you because I mean, maybe I should not ask that question. But for example, for my understanding, if you know the Hanafi school within Islam, which is in Sunni Islam, that allows drinking. So it allows drinking to a level that you will not get intoxicated, for example.
Okay.
So when somebody has a fixated, let's say somebody is an outsider of the religion and has a fixated image on what Muslims should behave, my point was that he's ignoring all the diversity of interpretations that exist within the Muslim faith, in which you have Sunni, Shia, multiple schools of Sunni, multiple schools of Shia, in which there is no one true Muslim. So if somebody, let's say, adhering to a different interpretation, a different sect of Islam, and then the other person telling him, no, you're not true Muslim or whatever, I think that it's an attack on the person and ignoring the diversity that exists within the Muslim community and the Muslim world. That was my point.
yeah. Okay. So thank you for explaining.
No,
that.
of course. No.
Should we then, because of this diversity, worry so much about what people necessarily believe, or should we worry about what actions are being taken as a result of that belief?
That's a money question. It's a great question.
Well, I mean, I as I mentioned, I am when the gentleman asked about whether religious enlightenment, people who are religious adhere to the Enlightenment values, and I've been very supportive of that. I mean, I've always been supportive of that. Is that if someone finds comfort in religion and thinks that he can adhere to the Enlightenment values, I have no problem with that whatsoever. But there is also another discussion whether beliefs drive action, which is another discussion to be had. But I think that I don't necessarily what people believe in, as long as their beliefs do not threaten the liberty of other people to have their beliefs or try to censor and build an authoritarian regime about that. So that's my live and let live is my philosophy for the most part, except on weekends. Sir.
Thank you for coming to Portland, Faisal. I have a quick
Happy to be here.
I have a quick two-part question. You talked about exporting Enlightenment values around the world. You talked most about the Middle East, since that's where you're from. So first off, do you think that the Rojava revolution in the revolution in Rojava, northeastern Syria area, can be
I like it when Westerners speak like a Middle Eastern city. It's fascinating sometimes.
Do you think that can be a good kickoff for spreading these Enlightenment values, since it is a revolution based on gender equality and so forth? And second part related, could you comment on the Iraq and Iranian government's recent attacks on Kirkuk and their expulsion of the Peshmerga from there, as well as the worry that Erdogan might also try something similar against the Kurds of Rojava as well?
I love politics. That's obviously a question outside the discussion today. But as when it comes to Rojava, so I mean the group that did most of the fighting, to be correct, is the YPJ, which is more YPJ, which is the more of actually just 2 days ago I was watching this documentary about TED about some of the wars happening there. So I mean, I'm gonna give you my view about one of the conflicts, especially coming from the Kurdish side, and it might sound contradictory a bit. Is that I do support the values of an independent Kurdistan, but also what I do have a problem with is countries that are built on national identity and ethnic identity, because I do think that goes against the values of the Enlightenment. So I think the countries should have an identity beyond ethnic identity. I think it should have an identity that is more based upon values. So the thing with YPJ, even though I do, of course, support them against ISIS and Assad and all of the gangs that are operating in both Syria and Iraq, but I do, the value that, many of the values that, I mean, if it's true that they are a Marxist organization, that actually ends the conversation. No, I don't think Marxism and Enlightenment are mixed, can be together, because Marxism is about removing the individual, actually focusing on the collective. So I think that the ideology of the YPJ, if they adhere to strict form of Marxism, I think that goes completely against the values of the Enlightenment. As for the question about Iran and the recent thing about Kirkuk, so I'm gonna give my opinion here. I mean,
Can you give it like 20 seconds? Because let me. Where's Andy? Andy, what are
Back
we?
here.
How much time do we have?
We have 3 minutes left till 8.
actually, can we extend the Q&A, because I do love the Q&A part. Is that okay with
Can
you,
we
Peter?
extend it by
I
five?
was going to
by
ask
5
that
minutes.
next.
Is that
Yeah.
okay?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you,
So
Andy.
can you wrap it up in a minute?
Yeah, I'm
We'll
going
see
to
if
wrap
we
it up in a
can-
bit. Kirkuk is a disputed land, in my opinion. I think that there should be negotiation between the Kurdish government, the KRG, and the Iraqi government, most importantly, how to move things further. I'm not a big fan of the Iraqi government or the KRG or the Iranian government or Erdogan. So I'm not going to defend any of them. But I think that the independence was so much rushed, the call for independence was so much rushed. I don't think Iraq, even though it's a fictional state, does not have a capacity to go into conversation about separation lines and stuff. I think our first enemy, our first focus should be defeating ISIS. And then when we have a civil society that are built up and institutions, we can have the conversation about independent Kurdistan. That's my view.
All right. Thanks. Good question.
Hi.
Very good political question, yeah.
Hi. So cultural sensitivity was briefly mentioned, and speaking on behalf of someone else of a minority group, dismissed as a silly thing to do. And I do realize the ways it can be silly.
I'm sorry, I missed that. What's a silly thing to do?
Speaking on behalf of someone else,
Okay.
where that person should know better.
Oh, being offended on behalf
Being
of someone
offended,
else.
sorry.
Yes.
Being offended. And I worry that dismissing it in that way might not be helpful, because it seems almost all or nothing or perfect or nothing attitude about how we should be that keeps us stuck and keeps us from making changes to the way we operate. We focus so much on the goal of 100% recovery from racism, sexism, or other kinds of isms. And the expectation to be perfect leads us to be blindsided by mistakes. And instead of feeling guilty about what we did, we end up feeling shame about being bad people. And shame keeps us from looking at our mistakes in a healthy way, and the cycle continues. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the role of shame and how values are portrayed in the political world.
That's a very good question, I would say.
Excellent, enormous question.
I mean, I think to say what I was talking about cultural sensitivity is that, and also I think the answer to the question was asking me about the Islamic world, is that when someone is kind of ignoring all the diversity and thinks that people belong on a certain community or certain group, that they're going to be offended by the same things. I think that's what I was trying to disprove. As in terms of, I mean, I have been offended on behalf of many people, especially when I think that they're being oppressed. So for example, many gay, in so many conversations when I go surrounded by religious people, conservative religious people, in which they're talking about gays in a very bad way or women in a very bad way, and I always jump in the conversation. I get fired from many meetup groups because of that. Is that I try to defend gay people even though I'm not gay or I'm not a woman. So I do think that defending people that I think that are oppressed from being attacked or being I think is very important. I think as for the power of shame, I think that it really depends if again back to the effective way of really changing people's minds. I have seen that shaming generally provokes a reaction that somebody, the first thing when you attack, they see it as a personal attack, which is kind of a problem. They see it as a personal attack, and the first thing they're going to do is to get defensive and then not necessarily listen to everything you're saying. So I do think that some of the, but that being said, as a society, we should have some values that when people break them, like for example, Harvey Weinstein or many of those folks, when they do bad things, I think we should shame them for doing what they're doing. So I think, I don't know if I sound contradictory here, but is that on a personal level, I think shaming doesn't work because people get immediately defensive and not listen to everything you say. But I think on a public square, if we have some values that we strongly defended, as we say, the values of the Enlightenment, and people don't adhere to that, I think it's fair to call them out when those people don't.
Yeah, I have a different take on this. That gets back to the gentleman's question about why we spend so much time on being offended, because it's an issue now. It's just part of the zeitgeist. My answer to that, and I'll just as a point of contact, I'll say the philosopher Bernard Williams doesn't think that shame is a legitimate emotion, and Aristotle says in the Ethics a good person shouldn't do a bad thing to feel shame. So with those 2 points of contact, I'll set the scaffolding for my response. I think that the way that we have dealt with offense in this culture is not just broken, but it's decreasing our resilience. I think what we need to do is not depend on other people to not say something that might hurt us or offend us. I think we need to go back to sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. In other words, we can't depend on other people not to say stupid, hurtful, racist, bigoted, awful, horrible things. And when they do say those things to us, the best response that we can have is that person's a jerk, or they're ignorant, or they're uneducated. But we shouldn't become emotionally crippled and held hostage to the words of others. And we are creating in our educational institutions exactly this kind of culture. We are crippling people emotionally, we're decreasing their resilience, and it's not possible for them to recover from the fact that you cannot control everything everybody says to you, or even anybody says to you. What you can control is your own reaction. And now what we've done is we've institutionalized, through microaggressions, et cetera, we've institutionalized the worst possible way that we can react to things. That's my answer. I think we have time for one more. Do we have time for one more?
Let's. I was hoping to do 2 quick ones.
Two quick ones.
And then the
we will be very quick, very quick.
Okay.
This young man with the hat on there has had his hand up for 15 minutes.
I would say 15 years.
So the whole premise of this conversation, if I'm understanding correctly, is that Enlightenment values should transcend and become universal. There are probably a group of people in another room on the other side of the world who are having the same conversation, and they're saying that their non-Western values should transcend and become universal. So what do you believe is the fundamental basis for values?
Awesome
and
question.
If there are no objective bases, then it's just a matter of preferences.
Who said there are no? Okay, so we're cool up into their no objective thing that came in at the very end. Like, you kind of smuggled that in there a little bit. I do think that it's possible. That's why I said it's just so important that we rationally derive our values. And we've spoken about this before, and whether or not someone can stand or sit or stand when they do the Pledge of Allegiance, I think that's totally wrong-headed. What we need to teach people to do is to understand why they're standing for the values, not force them to stand to be compelled to stand. I think that we can, in fact, I'm very confident that we can derive rational values. Here's very quick. John Rawls, the American philosopher, sets out a theme in the book, The Theory of Justice. Don't read it, it's 900 pages. It's literally like pounding your head against the cement. But you can read Wikipedia and you can read other little summaries, but he offers a way to think through, to rationally derive values and questions. And remember that if it depends what one's starting value is. If one's starting value is the Quran, and you're 100% correct, people are having these conversations about how to spread their own values. You know, submission to Allah. Or if the starting value, communism, it doesn't even have to be a religious value, or intersectionality, which is the new religion. So it is. So I think the idea is fundamental here that we need to start thinking about, and this is what I teach all of my students, the question is there such a thing as a moral fact? Like, we know that there are physical facts. We know that there are, how sound comes, how light, electromagnetism, etc. But are there moral facts? Are there things in the domain of morality in which one can be a moral expert in the same way that one can be an expert in the piano? Very long conversation. John Rawls, in my opinion, has the answer to that question.
Okay.
And they're enlightenment values, by the way.
Can you select the last person?
The guy in the hat back there for 20 minutes has been holding his hand up. Hello, son.
Sir. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming out tonight, and thank you for selecting me for the last question. You kind of hit on my question a little bit, but I want to expand if you don't mind.
Sure.
Professor, as you well know, there's
Peter.
Yeah. There is no you without an I. There's no I without a you. You can't conceive of an individual without a community. I define my first person plural in terms of 3,000 years of traditions, customs, and norms of what you call Western values, and the Enlightenment is an emergent quality of that. So my question to you is, what axiomatic ground do you use to justify asserting an abstract principle such as human rights onto a community who's conditioned?
You mean onto a community that already holds a set of values?
In a sense, but their whole conception of who they are, their first person plural as an individual, is conditioned upon, like, I'm conditioned on 3,000 years of Western tradition, customs, and norms.
Okay,
so how would you transplant an abstract principle that is a product of 3,000 years of Western development to a society whose doesn't have that development?
Yeah, so if your question is a logistical one in terms of how we do it, I don't know. I will tell you my guess. My guess is that we need exactly the opposite of what our foreign policy has been in many aspects of sanctions. We need reverse sanctions. We need to just dump a bunch of our DVDs, music, television, friends, all that stuff. We need to gain cultural superiority and cultural hegemony through mass media and our cultural institutions. That we need to, more Madonna or whoever's, I can't remember who my kids like today. So that's part of it, and I'm not being flippant when I say that. The other part is, I do think it comes down to, if you bracket the logistics, because ultimately, I really don't know, besides exposing them to the fact that, women and men interact and they don't have to go to separate places, and seeing things in our culture, and I'm not a cultural apologist for the United States. I'm not whitewashing any of the things we've done by any stretch of the imagination. The second part of that is the component for the penultimate question, the one before you, that I think is so vital, is that, and I think that this is what many on the left have lost and that what many on the right have, but for the wrong reasons. And that is that we can figure out right from wrong, that we can derive these values, and the best way to live by those, the best way to exemplify those values is to live by those values. So what does it mean, and with that whole proviso said, this administration has done a horrifically bad job of doing that. So I'm not an apologist for this administration either. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like having a correspondence between what you say and how you act, being sincere, not obfuscating, answering questions directly, living an authentic and honest life. And I think that if we do that as individuals, as kind of discrete atomic parts, those things are the best representations and manifestations of our values. And the best defense of that I can offer is what Faisal said before this, and that people will respect you. People respect that authenticity and that sincerity. And we need to create cultures where people can see. People want to come here. You know, when they went when the people protested in Tiananmen Square, they weren't bringing the Buddha. They were bringing the Statue of Liberty. There's something about American exceptionalism. There's something extraordinary about this country. And what is extraordinary are the values that we've founded it upon. And now we're losing that. It's slipping away from us. And the first place it's slipping away from us is in our academic institutions. And it's slipping away from us in our political system. And we need to regain that. So before we tell anybody anything, before we try to exert any kind of hegemony, soft power on anyone, we need to live it ourselves, and we need to reclaim it, and we need to articulate the reasons why the values that have come from the Enlightenment matter, and why people are trying to come to this country and literally dying for that. Thank you.
Oh, okay, well, what a note to end on. Let's give a standing ovation to both of our speakers.
Peter. I think it went great, yeah.